you may have been here 2 years ago when I gave the first presentation here about Agenda 21. I'm keeping the same title, the implementation of global policy at the local level, but I have updated it. If anyone can't hear me, please let me know. I know we don't have a microphone. I'll tell you next one. When I gave it 2 years ago, I hadn't given it very often anywhere else, but I did know that very few people, citizens, including and especially elected officials, were aware of how Agenda 21 and sustainable development, which is the philosophy of Agenda 21, was coming into, well, our nation, but our local governments especially. And I'm happy to say 2 years later that I've seen the public is really waking up, and more states, citizens, counties are taking action at the grassroots level. So that is encouraging, but there's a lot of work to be done, and it is a very complex issue. You can't just learn about it just like that. I'm trying to incorporate as many elements of it as I can tonight. If it gets a little long, just let me know. I'll come back next month and do the last half or something. Some of these slides are provided by a wonderful organization in Santa Cruz, California, Freedom Advocates. They were very supportive of me when I was appointed to the Wake County Sustainability Task Force, because I told them I was going in there against a consensus that was totally pro-sustainability. And they helped me, and I'd always liked them anyway. I'd heard of them before that and followed some of their alternative radio programs. They provide slides for any of you if you want to go on their website at freedomadvocates.org and download their PowerPoint slides. But I added my own research and some of the slides that I've made myself or captured off of other websites. Next to me. What is Agenda 21? Agenda 21 is a UN document and a UN program. Now, why should that concern us? Because the philosophy, the principles of the United Nations are completely opposite to our principles that we practice in the United States, based on our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, and the United States Constitution, and the principles of our local government. I will get to the details of Agenda 21 document later in the presentation. For now, though, please notice the term. Use this thing. You may not be able to see it, but right here it says Sustainable Development. This is the United Nations website. When this movement first started, when people first became aware of Agenda 21, the people promoting the ideals of sustainability, they don't call it Agenda 21 or Sustainable Development around here or anywhere. They want it to be under the radar. They call it, just say sustainability or green. So they would say, that doesn't have anything to do with Agenda 21, this document at the UN, but there it is. It's right on the UN website. Hi, Tom. What I'd like to do before I actually get into the details of the Agenda 21 document is to explain to you the core philosophical elements of sustainable development. I think it's really wiser to go out into the public and talk more about sustainable development, which is the philosophy of Agenda 21, because that appears in function everywhere. Whereas Agenda 21, who's going to go and read this 300-page document with all this bureaucratic techno language? So that's why I think it's important to understand the philosophy of it, and also because then you can recognize its hidden goals in legislation and initiatives, your city ordinances, what groups are trying to push when you go to community meetings. You can recognize it for what it is without seeing the word sustainability or Agenda 21. You can go to the next slide. Oh, yeah, I will show this again later, but this just shows that Agenda 21 is a comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations in the United Nations system, and we will get back to that later. You can go to the next. Oh, and I do want to point out why the United Nations philosophy is completely the opposite of our Declaration of Independence. This is the Freedom Advocate slide, and I won't read it all, but in the... I did. There. Oh, you have to hold it. I did. Right here it says in our Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. I think you all know this. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Our Creator is God. But over with the UN Declaration of Human Rights, they say that rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So what government can grant, what rights government can grant, government can take away if it's not based on our Creator. So you can go down to the next one.
Next.
Yes, next. Now, I'm going to get to the key concepts of sustainable development, and then we'll go to the Agenda 21 document itself. The first thing to know is the definition of sustainable development. Obviously, it's development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Please remember that term, future generations. If you see that in anything that's being written up today about sustainability or taking care of our community, it's pretty much a clue that there's some sustainability initiatives hidden in the motives of whoever's presenting that. The most commonly accepted definition, you can go to the next slide here, was given by its proponents in a UN report called Our Common Future during the 1987 United Nations World Commission on Environment and Development, which is UNCED, UNCED. And this Brundtland report, it's called the Brundtland report because it was chaired by this lady, Gro Harlem Brundtland, or Brundtland, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, the former director of the World Health Organization and the first female vice president of the World Socialist Party. That should be a tip-off right there that this definition is coming from a socialist viewpoint. This definition was later adopted at the United Nations Rio Earth Summit in 1992, where Agenda 21 was adopted. Gary can go to the next slide. Now, the second concept will tie to the first definition, also is based on future generations. This is called the precautionary principle. The idea is that we will preserve the earth and earth's resources for future generations. We go back to that original definition there. And the precautionary principle is the notion that despite the lack of scientific proof or scientific certainty, the government can force citizens to take precautions or government-prescribed measures to prevent a perceived future threat to the earth. So it's not proven there's a threat. Maybe there's a scientific consensus out there that got grants to say there is a threat, but it hasn't been absolutely proven. And as the late Dr. Henry Lamb, who passed on last year, one of the finest opponents of Agenda 21 this nation will ever know, he reminds us that sustainable development is government-approved development. You cannot have sustainable development without it being government-approved. Always remember that. Now here's a more specific anecdotal example of the precautionary principle, and I know a person this happened to in California. A landowner would be prohibited from walking on his property during the winter to prevent stepping on a long-toed salamander during its mating season on his own property. The problem is the precautionary principle leads to legal presumptions and burdens, and ultimately law enforcement will step in. And you've heard of these federal agencies going over to people's land and causing problems to the landowners because of an endangered species or water violation. You can go to the next one. Let's look at this. Some of you don't know that a lot of these ideas of sustainable development and the environmental movement really were embraced back by Vladimir Lenin in the Soviet Union, who was and he and Karl Marx were both very inspired by Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution. This is from the 1977 Soviet Constitution. It was supplied by freedom advocates. And let's compare this with the definition of sustainable development. In the interest of the present and future generations, there's your generations again, future generations, the necessary steps are taken in the USSR to protect and make scientific, rational use of the land and its mineral and water resources in the plant and animal kingdom. And on it goes, and to improve the human environment. That is very similar to our combination of the definition of sustainable development and the precautionary principle. You can go to the next one. This reasoning that mankind must take precautions to prevent harm to the environment and saving the earth for future generations, Agenda 21 planners, these global wealthy planners, state bluntly that our consumptive lifestyles must change. Theirs don't have to change, but ours do. Here's a statement by environmental activist attorney Daniel Sittard. He was actually the editor of the original Agenda 21 document, which actually, I believe, was about 1,000 pages long. These editors have reduced it, and I think there's several variations, but they're all about 300 to 350 pages long, the ones for public consumption. He said that Agenda 21 proposes an array of actions which are intended to be implemented by every person on Earth to cause for specific changes in the activities of all people. Effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of all humans, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. Go to the next one. And here's another, some of you know this one very well. This is actually one of the most often quoted statements about Agenda 21, stated by Maurice Strong, who was the Secretary General and presided at the UN's Rio's Earth Summit. I'll talk about him a little bit more later, but he is involved in a lot of things. He's a Canadian billionaire as well. And he said that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class, involving high meat intake, use of fossil fuels, appliances, home and work air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable. Go to the next one here. In other words, this is not sustainable.
Raleigh.
You know,
A lot of places.
you should have a picture of what his house looks like.
Well, he's hiding out in China because he was implicated in the welfare food scandal at the UN. And he can't even come home to his wealthy ranch that's out there, and it's a cosmic humanist new age ranch that I don't think we would ever be allowed to take a picture of. But it's a good suggestion otherwise. All right, let's go to the next slide here. All right, now this is probably, to me, maybe the most essential concept of sustainable development that you really need to know. This is, you'll see it in a second here. It's all right. This was what got me through defeating the North Carolina Benefit Corporation legislation and helped me to recognize that it also helped to get me through the Wake County Sustainability Task Force, because I was able to recognize initiatives where they didn't use the words Agenda 21, and a lot of times they didn't use the word sustainability. So this is a concept called the 3 E's. If you understand them, you'll really understand the essentials. That's the first E, equity. There, you can bring in a second. Second E is economy, and the third is environment. Now, since the Rio Earth Summit adopted the term sustainable development, the term sustainability or sustainable, which you do see, you have to admit, you see that in the newspapers, you see it all over the place. You rarely see the word development stuck on there. But this term has been persistently popularized by activists and media as a buzz term that most people interpret to mean taking care of the earth or saving the environment. But there's vastly more to sustainable development than just green initiatives and taking care of the environment. Let's go on to the next one. This freedom advocate slide puts it in very brief words, and then I'll amplify on that. Environment is nature before man. Equity is using the law to re-engineer humanity. What I'm trying to say here is that these words don't mean the same thing that they usually mean to us in the way we've been brought up to think about these words. Economy is international redistribution of America's wealth and the replacement of free enterprise with government, business, partnerships. We'll all get into much more in depth in a little while. Next. Here's a chart. I found several nice ones, but here's one I put on the screen for you that represents the 3 E's. There are a lot of them out there, but as you can see, here's the environment, here's economy, and here's the word social. Instead of equity, they often use the word social because it represents social equity, which I will explain in a minute. These all merge together to create sustainability. These 3 circles.
Raleigh.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. How about that? This is from the Raleigh City website. Raleigh's 3 spheres of sustainable development.
Carefully.
All right, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm not pointing at you. Don't worry. Okay. I forgot it was on there. Raleigh has an entire section on their website on sustainability as they aspire to be the most sustainable city in the Southeast, according to Mayor Meeker in a PowerPoint presentation he gave years ago. Don't go to the next one yet. Let me just add to the Freedom Advocates' brief explanation. Environment places nature above man. Man is a threat to nature. Man's rights extend only as far as the government allows for the common good, not for individual rights. Economy is the redistribution of wealth internationally and the creation of public-private partnerships. Redistribution of wealth is the unjust or forced redistribution of wealth. It takes from the wealthy to give to the poor, effectively lowering the standard of living in America to that of the rest of the world, especially effective in the middle class, so they like to say they're redistributing from the wealthy to the poor. Public-private partnerships combine the power of business with the force of government, and I'll talk about that a lot more in a while. Equity is often associated with the term social, so sometimes you'll see social a lot. If you see the word social and environmental and social and economic in anything you read, that's a tip-off. You're getting at least 2 of the 3 E's. In the United States, originally equity means equality of opportunity. We all have an opportunity to make what we can of our lives. We all start out with an equal footing as far as having the opportunity and freedom to progress. But in sustainable development, equity means the equality of material possessions or resources or equality of results. Everyone has to have the same outcome. You've heard of outcome-based education. Equity also, social equity focuses on class distinctions and groups. Another expression for social equity, and some of you have heard this from Glenn Beck, some of you, I'm sorry to say, have heard it quite a bit in your churches, is social justice. Social justice subordinates the American concept of equal justice for the individual to the concept of collectivism. So social justice collectivizes individual rights into equal rights for groups, such as employees, women, the poor, the unions, the unemployed, the minorities, the community even. Anything that's a group. Another term that you should learn in relation to social equity is stakeholder. S-T-A-K-E, holder. Stakeholders are those who are affected by or have a stake in an organization, a corporation, a stake in the community, and the examples are the same as I gave for social equity. Employees, consumers, unions, minorities, the community, really everybody. But they're usually referred to collectively in groups. It is a socialistic concept at odds with the independence, motivation, and self-government of individuals. I can't state it better than Michael Novak states it in his book, The Fire of Invention, Civil Society, and the Future of the Corporation, which Bob Luddy, some of you may know, sent to me because I asked him if he could send me a book that is a good history on corporations, on the history of the corporation. On page 43, Novak states that stakeholders are all those who deem themselves entitled to make demands on the system and to receive from it. Those needs are infinitely expansive, however, so perpetual dissatisfaction is guaranteed, unquote. They're never satisfied. All right, honey. Go to the next one. This is the Raleigh City website. This is their sustainability section. They went to the trouble to have a sustainability logo. And wouldn't you know, if you know what the 3 E's are, they're implied in this abstract little squishy logo there. And if you, where does it go? I get into this and forget what, yes, I will. I'll try to keep things from being on. If you look down here carefully, and you can go on the website, it's probably still there, there's the 3 E's right there. They say sustainability is a broad term that addresses 3 fundamental principles: economic strength, environmental stewardship, and social equity. Right there on our Raleigh City website. All right, let me go to the next slide. The international focus for sustainable development is on the United States. We're their prime target because America is the only country in the world that's based on the ideals of private property. Private property is incompatible with the collectivist premise of sustainable development. Sustainable development has 3 components to achieve its goal: to control you and seize your property. They are global education, global land use, and global population control and reduction. Now, once you're aware of Agenda 21, it's easy to attract the global education that's flooding our schools through environmental studies and social studies programs. We could develop a whole program on that, but it's such a huge topic. I'm not going to get into that tonight. There are others who are taking it up. 2 programs I will mention are the International Baccalaureate program that's in many of our schools today, and the Common Core curriculum, which Marissa is handling so ably, and maybe she'd like to even someday expand it to talk about some of the relationship. I find in Agenda 21 education, I've been through the document, and it seems to focus more on how to put sustainable concepts into education. Though, of course, they want us to completely convert to global world values. But I will mention that there are other UN programs. This isn't the only one. Agenda 21 is not the only one. And some fund researchers have tracked Common Core curriculum back to the UN's World Core curriculum that the former, I think it was Assistant Secretary General of the UN, Robert Mueller, developed decades before. So not everything comes from Agenda 21, and if you try to say it does to people, they start thinking you're a little bit over the top. So I recommend you don't always point, say, this to Agenda 21 just because it's a global initiative. Two action plans that exemplify, I would like to focus more on the land and population components because they're not as readily apparent to the public. Two action plans that exemplify the land and population components are the Wildlands Project and Smart Growth, or more plainly, the rural and the urban. You can go to the next slide here. I just showed that other slide. Everything in there is really not considered to be sustainable. Hay is one of them. Briefly, both the Wildlands Project and Smart Growth are about moving populations out of the rural land areas. And we have Smart Growth in Raleigh and in Cary. It's about moving populations out of the rural land areas in the name of saving the natural environment, animals, habitat, moving populations into crowded urban areas where centralized government planning regulates every aspect of urban life. Tell me if some of this doesn't sound familiar to you already. Public transportation, pedestrian walkways and bicycle paths, traffic calming patterns, open spaces such as parks and greenways, pack 'em and stack 'em housing, water use, food supply, medicine, energy, work environment, and so on. Smart growth policies include plans that reduce the freedom of mobility. People must live near where they work and not go everywhere in their cars. And they transport communities into heavily regulated but self-sufficient, feudalistic transit villages. For example, the Smart Growth Plan for Richland County, South Carolina, distinguishes between employment-based villages and non-employment-based villages, with special gated communities set aside for wealthy individuals who are responsible for the Smart Growth Plan. And this is footnoted in the Freedom Advocates booklet that I have a copy if you'd like to see it after the meeting. Most of the non-employment-based villages are slated to be built in areas currently populated by the descendants of liberated slaves. The Freedom Advocate booklet offers this quote: "A typical day in the Orwellian society created by Smart Growth will consist of an individual waking up in his government-provided housing unit, eating a ration of government-subsidized foods purchased at a government-sanctioned grocery store, walking his children, if he has any, to the government-run child care center, then boarding government-subsidized public transit to go to his government job, then returning home later that evening." And that's in the most recent booklet Freedom Advocates puts out. They live in Santa Cruz, California, the guinea pig county for Local Agenda 21, where it was literally started there. So
Sounds like slavery.
yeah, yeah. All right, let's see. You can go to those on that. Yeah. Now I'm going to talk about the rural component, the Wildlands Project. The Wildlands Project came out of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which is a document that was ratified as a hard law treaty at the same Rio Earth Summit where Agenda 21 was adopted. And the Wildlands Project came out of that convention, and the accompanying UN Biological Diversity Assessment was how they assessed what is biodiversity. The assessment deems not sustainable most human activities that form our modern civilization. Freedom Advocates went through and actually called out all the different categories of what's not sustainable. Here's some of the things they came up with. It's a huge list. Private property, it's not sustainable. Fossil fuels, consumerism, farming, irrigation, commercial agriculture, pesticides, herbicides, farmland, grazing of livestock. That's why you don't see quite as much beef in the supermarkets. Paved roads, golf courses, ski lodges, logging, dam reservoirs, fences, power lines, suburban living, and the family unit. And I remember seeing on that list Judeo-Christian religion, which they consider to be selfish and exclusive and intolerant. You can go to the next. The Wildlands Project would set up 1/2 of America into core wilderness reserves and interconnecting corridors, all surrounded by interconnecting buffer zones. No human activity would be permitted in the red, you see the red, and only highly regulated activity would be permitted in the yellow. 4 concerned activists who made up the board of an organization, Sovereignty International, were able to find UN documentation that proved the Wildlands Project was to provide the basis for the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. An American hero that hardly anyone knows about was Dr. Michael Kaufman, who was the CEO of Sovereignty International, and he was actually asked to do a study on this biological diversity, I think for Congress, to prove it's good, and he was so alarmed at what he found that he did the research. He created this wildlands map, which is pretty famous now on the internet, and he, in the last hour, literally stopped the ratification of the treaty before its scheduled cloture and ratification vote. Well, we may be living in some of these little groups. The green areas are where we're permitted to live. See those little green areas? Yeah.
Have you already explained what the whole agenda is to cluster people in these little bunches?
Yes, Hill.
Yeah, okay. Sorry.
And please hold your questions and comments till I'm finished, unless there's something you absolutely can't go on until you understand what I'm talking about. All right, the next slide here, please. Go back to that same slide I showed you earlier about Agenda 21, because I'd like to go in now to the actual document and the details of the document. The Agenda 21 document is 40 chapters, over 300 pages to 350 pages long. The PDFs I have show 350 pages. As I said before, it's reduced from original 1,000 pages or so. It is intentionally written so that it's hard to wade through. It's got lots of dry, repetitive phrases. It's really hard to read. So you won't detect the hardcore goals hidden in all that text. This is called transparent impenetrability, according to Lord Monckton. Some of you may be aware of him. He's an aristocrat from England and an editor. He's written columns, and he's a well-known global warming skeptic and an opposer of Agenda 21. And because he has connections, he's been to a lot of these global UN meetings. And he was told that that's what they call it, transparent impenetrability, by someone who's involved with these documents. And so what the deal is with that is they'll tell you if they weren't hiding anything, it's right in the document, but they know good and well that you're not going to have the fortitude to read it. But I may make a suggestion. If you want to figure out what's in there and you're interested in a subject, pull up the document by PDF. It's easy to find. Do a word search. Pick a word. Schools, for instance, education, social, environment. And it'll take you to each time the word's in the document. And that's a great way to figure out how these ideas are interspersed. Sustainability activists like to claim that local sustainability has nothing to do with the Agenda 21, but there it is again, right in front of us at the top there. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, well, we've already talked about that. Oh, you could go back for a second there, if you can. That's all right. The previous slide did show that also when they adopted Agenda 21, if you could go to that second statement, not the first one, the next one. No, the statement is in the slide. It's all right. You can't go. Now the next one. This one. The Commission on Sustainable Development was created in 1992 to ensure effective follow-up of UNCED, which was the Agenda 21. So, just so you know, they created a Commission on Sustainable Development at the same time. All right, now you can go to the next one. This is one of my favorites. J. Gary Lawrence. UN planners know that the American public won't willingly give up their lifestyle, the people. That is why, for political expediency, the political agenda embodied in sustainable development is often implemented under other names. J. Gary Lawrence was a planner for the city of Seattle, and he also served as an advisor on the President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development in 1993. In 1998, when speaking to a UN group in London, and I have the whole PDF from them, so I'm not making this up from some conspiracy website, he said, quote, participating in a UN-advocated planning process would very likely bring out many who would actively work to defeat any elected official undertaking local Agenda 21. So, we will call our process something else, such as, quote, comprehensive planning, does that sound familiar? Quote, growth management, or, quote, smart growth. So they'll use anything to get around Agenda 12, the people knowing what is going on. And that, I have that, you can find that online, that's the original document where he said it. All right, yeah. Just so you'll understand how the setup was at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, they produced 5 main documents, not just Agenda 21. 2 of them were called hard law documents, which means that they implemented a treaty that was legally binding upon the people who the countries that ratified it. And the soft law is policy, called soft law documents. Soft law means that, for now, it's just accepted policy by those nations, but they're going to move towards trying to implement hard law in the future. So don't think just because these people who are against what we say in the news, they constantly say, this isn't legally binding, it's not bad. I've proved that the planners for the Rio Earth Summit 20 years later, Rio Plus 20, stated that their intention is to move towards hard law. Okay. Let me just, there are 8 key areas that the Agenda 21 document covers. Education, energy and housing, population, agriculture, biodiversity and ecosystem management and public health, resources and recycling, and transportation. Agenda 21 was adopted by more than 178 governments at the United Nations, the Rio Earth Summit. These are the 5 documents that came. Can you go back up? Oh, I already discussed that. Never mind. We'll stay here. I want to make this perfectly clear. This is not a partisan political issue. Both Republicans and Democrats have been complicit in moving Agenda 21 into the United States. George Herbert Walker Bush was the signatory for the United States when 178 nations adopted it, Agenda 21 at the Rio Earth Summit. And look what he said at that time. It is the sacred principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter to which the American people will henceforth pledge their allegiance. Pam, we need a new flag in here.
Get the green fluffy stuff.
All right, can I do the next slide? This is a very important fact to know. President Clinton established by Executive Order 12852, the President's Council on Sustainable Development, the purpose of implementing Agenda 21 in the United States. Because the Senate didn't ratify the treaty, Agenda 21 is a hard law treaty, he went around that by using an executive order, which is really not meant for these purposes. You're not supposed to be using executive orders just to do whatever the president wants to do. The council only operated through 1999, but it was successful as a vehicle to put sustainable development on the move in local communities across the nation. The President's Council was with the assistance of change agents, just as J. Gary Lawrence, who I just quoted, laid a foundation for intermediate and local councils that were intended to change the structure of government in the United States. So President Clinton paved the way for Agenda 21 sustainable development policies to bypass national and state representative approval of elected officials, and that's what's being done over and over again. Elected officials are increasingly losing their power to govern. Rather, policy would be implemented in local communities through a system of councils. You can go to the next one. Actually, Gary, I think if you press it, the major statement will come forward.
Here?
Yeah. This is just to prove in there. He said that he's responding to the recommendations in Agenda 21. You want to?
Respond to the recommendations of Agenda 21, the comprehensive international policy declaration nations of the world agreed to as a pledge to global environmental action, and contribute to the U.S. plan to be submitted to the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development, the International Commission created at the Earth Summit to help ensure implementation of Agenda 21. That is one mouthful. What does that mean? Anyway.
It's transparent impenetrability. All right, you can go on to the next
Click
one.
again.
Just down to there. All right, let's just talk about councils for a minute, because this is important to understand. What does the word Soviet mean? We all know the Soviet Union was a communist country. A Soviet, and Z may know this, having come from that neck of the world, a Soviet is a system of councils that report to an apex council and implement a predetermined outcome affecting a region, remember that word, region, or neighborhood, often arranged the process of facilitated consensus. Try to remember those words. Facilitated consensus. Let's just go on. We won't go through the next two. Under President George W. Bush, these various councils, under many names, suddenly appeared in every county in the country. He didn't speak out against it. Let's name some local councils. How about Triangle J, Council on Government, which is one of 16 regional councils in North Carolina. The Triangle Chapter, Council on a Sustainable Triangle, known as CFAS. Also, nationally, there's the U.S. Green Building Council. There are thousands and thousands of these councils now. All right. In his first term in office, President Obama used unconstitutional executive orders to create a number of national councils to implement piecemeal UN treaties that Congress would not sign, or to further overall goals outlined in Agenda 21 and other United Nations documents. In case you really don't understand it, executive orders are official documents numbered consecutively through which the President of the United States manages the operations of the federal government. He's really supposed to only issue these to administer orders to the agencies or the workings of the federal government, not to make new laws for us or treaties.
I think it's supposed to be limited executive branch only.
It is.
That he
So I heard someone
controls.
on Southern for Glenn Beck, a talk show host who's in the intelligence agency, say that is not the case, that it's implement any executive action. Let's see now. So he implemented the National Ocean Council in July 19, 2010, and this was really to implement the UN Law of the Sea Treaty because they weren't getting anywhere with getting it ratified by our nation. So the Law of the Sea Treaty was formerly known as the Third United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and its purpose is to establish a comprehensive set of rules governing the ocean and to replace previous UN conventions on the laws of the sea. It calls for technology transfers and wealth transfers from developed to undeveloped nations. So there's your redistribution of wealth. And I won't go on and on with all of that, but it talks about the pollution of the marine environment. It's interesting that in 1982, President Reagan rejected the Lost Treaty, Law of the Sea Treaty. People call it Lost, and that's a good name for it. And Edwin Meese, who was the U.S. Attorney General at the time under Reagan, said that the Lost Treaty was out of step with the concepts of economic liberty and free enterprise that Ronald Reagan was to inspire throughout the world. But it's interesting that the National Ocean Council, which Obama's executive order created, incorporates a section of the 1992 Rio Declaration, which we saw as one of the 5 documents of the Rio Earth Summit, and that declaration is like it's a declaration. They just declare all the principles that they support. They're doing all these other documents, but you can track it back. So it is related to the Rio Earth Summit. All right, Gary, go to the next one. I forgot there's that picture too about the Law of the Treaty. That's a mouthful. UN Law of the Sea Treaty. Say that 5 times in a row. All right, Gary. And then, I know this one's dear to Pam's heart. Also, President Obama created the National Rural Council, Executive Order 13575, and I remember the Blaze, Glenn Beck, the Blaze did a really good article about that back then. I have it somewhere. And this Executive Order Rural Council was to ensure that the American rural population has strong, sustainable communities. There is an appointment of 25 members to that council, including all 15 heads of the executive departments in President Obama's cabinet. Not a single department was left out. And Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack had the option to designate anyone to serve on this powerful council, so he could ask someone else who's bad to come in there. Okay, on to the next one. All right, now this could get long, and Pam, if you think we're going long, I can skip this. But this is the reinvention of government. All right, I've been speaking for 45 minutes, so, okay. Tell me when to stop if this goes too long. I can come back.
Okay.
All right? Freedom Advocates did this wonderful chart, and Gary's going to press the little button and show some of the ones. The two concepts that are very much related to all of this, the UN endeavors and Agenda 21. There's one, if you could point to where it says government-private partnerships. See how it's going into sustainable development. And then if you press the, to bring up some of the other, keep going. Regionalism. I don't know if you can see that one, regionalism. No, that's it. We can't do any more tonight. The reason I've decided to bring these two up is especially because a number of you have, since I spoke here 2 years ago, expressed more and more concern and awareness of these two concepts. Both of them, too, have something that binds them together. You can go to the next. Yes, please. No, the next slide. I know, sorry. But before I tell you what binds them together, I will state that our U.S. constitutional system is built on the principle of checks and balances. For instance, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches keep a check on each other at the federal level. Then we have the vertical federal, state, county, city jurisdictions that keep a check on each other. And then in the free enterprise system, ideally public and private business sectors should be separate because often it leads to corporate cronyism, monopolies. Often the little guy gets left out in the cold, and on and on it goes. All right, Wynne. The regionalism and public-private partnerships that many people just like to call PPPs are about the blending and blurring of boundaries. And if you don't believe me, I'll prove it in a few minutes. Remember that blending and blurring. I won't get into this too much because I think many of you are already aware that, let me just tell you what regionalism is. And I wrote this little essay, and I'll just read you a little bit of it. What is regionalism? In the 20th century, more specifically in the 1950s, various individuals resented the basic concepts of freedom established by our founding fathers in the Constitution of the United States of America. They disdained the state constitution, city and county charters and laws, and were established on those these constitutional concepts of freedom. This resentment resulted in a union of two types of people: the progressives and what I call the predatories. The idealistic progressives had a socialistic collectivist vision for society in which the government or the totalitarian state would make all decisions for the benefit of the people. And the predatories, as you know the word predator, were willing to destroy our constitutional system of government to benefit their personal greed and lust for power. Since both sets of individuals considered the U.S. Constitution and national sovereignty to be an inconvenient impediment to their goals, they collaborated to destroy it. Aided by powerful tax-exempt foundations such as the Rockefeller, Carnegie Foundations, and the Club of Rome, they set in play a process to consolidate their power, wiping out our traditional form of representative government and replacing it with regional governance, also known as metropolitan government. Now, regions, in their mind, ignore traditional jurisdictional boundaries and attempt to merge political boundaries into ever-expanding geographic regions of consolidated power. These regions are designed to be administered by unelected, appointed experts and bureaucrats, such as those found internationally in the European Union. I think you're all pretty familiar with that. Or in the states of the United States. And those organizations are known as councils on government. This, in essence, creates a shadowy extra layer of government whose administrators are not elected by the people. At every level of government, this system robs elected officials of their power to govern. It has been proven over and over that regional, metro government is no respecter of citizens' individual rights to own and manage property. I got a lot of wonderful information from a researcher. Her books are out of print. You can find them occasionally. Jo Hindman, it's a female, who had her own columns, her own, she wrote for a lot of different outlets. And she did so much research. You wouldn't believe all the research that's so well documented. This is one of her books, The Metrocrats, that explains the system. And I've learned so much, but it's tough to read through all. I've read all 3 of her books. So I'm not making any of this up. This isn't... She lived through that history when a lot of this was being done. And according to her, this regional or metro removal of traditional political boundary lines is accomplished in 5 steps. City-county, county district, district-state, state-region, and region international. And I'll show you a few maps just to illustrate what I'm talking about. Now this one, I'm not going to spend any time on. This is just to show you that these are the 10 regions. The UN promotes the idea of 10 regions. The Club of Rome, which is a sort of international think tank that came up with a lot of ideas regarding Agenda 21 and population growth, they came up with this idea. But I want to get right to the United States. Now, what many of you don't know is that, well, first of all, let me say the United States Constitution, Article 4, Section 3, states that, quote, new states may be admitted to the Congress by the Congress, only the Congress, into this union. But no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of 2 or more states, or parts of states, without the consent of the legislatures or the states concerned, as well as the Congress. But March 27, 1969, President Nixon, through the Government Reorganization Act, divided the United States into 10 administrative regions. At the same time, he established the Environmental Protection Agency. So using Executive Order 11647, which is entered in the Federal Register, check it out if you don't believe me, President Nixon established a Federal Regional Council, notice the word council, for each of the 10 standard regions. It stated that the President shall designate 1 member of each council as chairman of the council, and such chairman shall serve at the pleasure of the President. So, the fact that the state borders have been destroyed to create 10 regions instead of 50 union states has now been publicized by our government. How many of you knew about the 10 federal regions? Rocco and you know. They prefer for us to be kept in the dark. But why do you think the use of the word region is so broad spread in the media and politics and government speech at city council? You hear the word region much more than you hear our state or... In fact, Gary, I don't know if you passed this twin visioning. Yeah. This to me, this is from Rocky Mount, North Carolina last year. They're about to implement this in September. And I'll be talking about a little bit more later after I discuss some other aspects. It's the best example of what I'm talking about on many levels, but I'll get to it later. But notice they use the word region in there proudly. Another researcher has claimed, and he says he got this information from the Commission for Constitutional Treaties, that the reason President Nixon actually did this 10-region executive order is the United Nations passed a resolution that the United States must reorganize into 10 super regions, and President Nixon complied by issuing an executive order. Now, I can't prove it. I don't have that Commission for Constitutional Treaties, but he has an address where you could write for it. I might try it. I don't know if it's still in existence. Whatever the reason he did it, it's unconstitutional and it's wrong. It's undermining our constitutional system. The idea of regionalism wasn't new to Nixon, though, and let's go to the next slide. Someone gave me this a long time ago. It's very valuable. It's a photocopy of an old New York Times Magazine map and a New York Herald Tribune article about regional government. You can see it.
I can read it. The New York Times Magazine, April 23rd, 1935. That's what it says up there.
Mm-hmm.
Right, in here, a copy of the same, Sunday, January 1943. So this is something that goes back 80 years.
Well, the caption says, Regionalism, or the new federalism, as our President Nixon refers to it, that's because this is an old article, is depicted here as it was proposed almost 40 years ago. It proposed 9 groups instead of the 48 states, because Alaska and Hawaii were states in 1959. If you want to scroll, and that article there, and I have lots of copies if anyone ever wants one, is a man who's promoting this idea of regionalism. It says national sovereignty is outmoded and we need to have regionalism for the common good. I'm going to scroll on down. That's the map of 1935 with the 9 regions. Go on. And this is the 10 regions. And I already showed you a big color map, which someone enlarged that and colored it in. And I showed you that. Okay. This is in Wikipedia, just if you're doubting that some of the research I've done. Standard federal regions. There you go. Okay. Now, let's get on to the state. All right, the state councils of government. I attended this at the North Carolina General Assembly. I noticed that one of the committee on, National Economic Environmental Resources, chaired by Representative Pat McElrath, they were going to have a presentation by the North Carolina Regional Councils on COGS, Councils of Government, and I was so interested I asked if I could attend, and I did, and I learned that you can go on the legislature's website and actually see what the presentations are they're going to be using. And I found this PowerPoint presentation, and I got to watch them give it. Here's just 1 or 2 slides I took from it, so you'll understand that about the time when all these predatory and progressives were promoting this idea of regionalism, and some of them were very, very powerful, what they did is they found ways to put out model legislation to the states from a certain location, so all of the states would be considering the same legislation. And they did that with the idea of creating regional councils in the states. So, when you know, in 1968, the regional councils in North Carolina are the result of 1968 federal legislation that was created, and this book documents it, and so do they at the legislature. They created a system of multi-county regional planning districts. And then, in the state legislature in 1972, created 16 regions with councils of government. You can go down to the next slide. And there they are. In case you're wondering, they gave us that map. And we're Triangle J. That's why you keep hearing about Triangle J Regional Council. It's because we're one of 16 councils of government. Okay. Yes. What's the purpose? What is the purpose of these? Well, they're asked to help our local communities. They've got too much to do. We don't want to duplicate government efforts. They really wanted to do was get rid of a whole list of elected reasons to have elected people do these things. And I read about the short ballot. I just learned about that. The same man who came up with some of these other concepts. And they don't want us to have to elect people that we trust. They want unappointed, unelected bureaucrats to handle some of these things that will go on board with sustainable development. So they created, this man explained to us, the representative of the North Carolina Regional Council, that what the councils do is help the local governments, especially the poorer ones, to get grants, federal grants, which then ensnare them into the web of sustainable development and all other types of things that are going on today. And as you see, I made the arrows there. It says that the local governments choose to be members, but hey, you know, there's peer pressure, there's needing money, there's all sorts of reasons that they join when they don't want to. And we know that our Wake County commissioners who spoke at the Wake County Taxpayers Association, when they were questioned, they spend a lot of dues money for it, and they don't get very much for it. And Guilford County was complaining about that too. They have to spend a lot of money to join these things. So then these cogs, as they're called, I call them cogs in the wheels of liberty, they go out and induce all of these local governments to get ensnared in a lot of sustainability concepts if you go on their website. Okay, Gary. Pam discovered this last night, so I had to quickly insert it into the presentation. Another aspect of regionalism is, we just talked about the government aspect of regionalism. Well, now we're talking about the business. You've heard of public-private partnerships. It's a government-business relationship. Well, the businesses put their 2 cents worth, and in the late 80s, they decided, they called for collaborative regional strategies out of Charlotte, Piedmont, and the Research Triangle to recruit business and attract investment and create jobs. Okay. So what happened? North Carolina created 7 economic development regions. So we have 16 government-style regions, and now we have 7 economic development regions. Okay, here. In 1993, a year after Agenda 21 was adopted, the North Carolina General Assembly saw regionalism's capacity to create economic opportunities for the state. So they created Regional Economic Development Commission in 4 rural areas, and recognized the 3 regional partnerships anchored in urban areas. Thank you, Pam. Yes. Oh, this is important. We love that word consensus. That means collectively agreeing on something in a pure democracy where most of the people believe something, so we have to go along with it. To stay ahead of global competition, we must identify strategies to further integrate workforce development, economic development, and education at the regional level, where companies, workers, researchers, entrepreneurs, and governments, companies and governments, come together to create a competitive advantage. And that's from the U.S. Department of Labor employment. We're getting ready to talk about public-private partnerships, and this is the perfect lead-in to that. What is a public-private partnership? It's when the public government teams up, partners with private business.
Isn't that a lot of work for chronic?
Yeah, it is, but it's also a word for economic fascism. And economic fascism was actually practiced in Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, though if you run around saying Hitler, everybody gets a little concerned. But Mussolini definitely practiced this idea of fascism. And really, even the communist countries today, China, they practice fascism more than communism because they combine government and business. But they control the business. They, when the Soviet Union was deteriorating, it was because they let the state do everything. But then they all realized, let's get these big companies to do our work. We'll dictate and give them the advantages, and they'll go out and make the products and do all of these things for us. That system really is working better for them than these pure communistic states that run out of resources. Okay. Here's an example. Now, Agenda 21 is big on public-private partnerships. In fact, you might want to read the Prince Charles, the Sustainable Prince by Joe Dion. He practically launched the UN's idea for public-private partnership. And he's huge on this sustainable development. So forget about Kate. Yeah, I know. Tell me if you want me to stop, because Agenda 21 language, typically found. Government, business, and industry, including transnational corporations, to strengthen partnerships to implement the principles and criteria for sustainable development. Government should identify and implement an appropriate mix of economic instruments and normative measures such as laws and legislation, including business and industry, consultation of business and industry, including transnational corporations, and on and on it goes. Then they throw us a bone just to be on the safe side and say voluntary private initiatives should also be encouraged. Yeah, right. Okay. Now, what's going on right now, the Obama administration was in Carver with the Chapel Hill Chamber of Commerce in June 2011 exploring this idea, is an expansion of public-private partnership idea known as the Fourth Sector Initiative. Instead of just combining government with for-profit companies, now they want to also merge the relationship with non-profit. So you've got public plus for-profit companies plus non-profit to create a new fourth sector, a blended sector. That's called the fourth sector. Now I said that all this is about the blending and blurring of lines in every way. You can go to this next. Yes. Here's the fourthsector.net website. That is the key website that promotes the Fourth Sector Initiative. Look right there, Gary, if you point right there. This is the homepage. The boundaries between the public, private, and social sectors are blurring. Our fourth sector is emerging. And they like to use that New Age language a lot, too. The New Age movement is very much also behind sustainable development. I can't go into all that tonight, but they helped launch the President's Council on Sustainable Development, along with the government people. Now, we're going towards the home stretch here. Bear with me. This is what really I started talking about in the beginning in 2010. Actually, I've been studying this for 20 years, so this isn't new to me, but it was new to people. And when President Obama went into office, people woke up. They suddenly became concerned, and they were receptive to hearing about it. First time in 20 years. UN Agenda 21, Global to Local, courtesy of Freedom Advocates. This slide shows two UN documents. On the cover of one document, you see Agenda 21 refers to the Earth, meaning international. But there's also a local Agenda 21 planning guide, and that's specifically geared to implementing sustainable development Agenda 21 policy in your local communities. If you don't get anything else from this, essentially the initial plan, and now the federal and state are a little more into it, but originally they circumvented the state and that federal government and went straight into the local community, straight from the UN. How did they do that? Yeah. Here's an example. Freedom Advocates is in Santa Cruz County. They're the guinea pig. If you don't believe that Agenda 21 had a plan, there you go. Santa Cruz County, local Agenda 21, a sustainable community action plan, our agenda for the 21st century. That was the first one where they did that. And they're still doing it. Right. Yes, stay there. All right, this wouldn't be a talk on Agenda 21 if we didn't talk about consensus and visioning meetings, which some of you may have experienced. I certainly have. Now, socialistic sustainable development ideas are being forced on us as policy and law, where we have no choice about how we live, where we go, whom we visit. Now, this is happening not only through global education, through cultural institutions, museums, and schools. I personally went against the Explorer School because they tried to implement that, and that most people didn't realize. They were upset because public money was used for it. They should have been upset if they went into it and listened to what they said. It was the first school to educate young people and adults about sustainable development and the core leaders of it. I walked through it and I wrote about 5 letters to the paper. Back then they actually published them. I contacted my legislators and I wrote everybody I could.
What kind of responses were you getting when you did that?
I'll talk about
Okay.
that. Thanks for asking that. Also, though, another way they implement it is through reports and recommendations submitted to local elected officials by appointed councils, task forces, which I was on the sustainability task force in Wake County, community stakeholder councils, and visioning meetings. Visioning meetings invite citizens and community leaders to envision what an improved quality of life would be like under sustainable development. And I passed around that twin visioning. That's what already happened in Rocky Mount. They already had one of those meetings. My lovely aunt, 89 years old, volunteered and went into that, just for my sake, and attended every meeting. They use special terminology and expressions to make participants at these meetings feel enlightened, professional, and in the know about the advances in community planning. And at the same time, these expressions touch their emotions, that they're working together to accomplish something bigger than ourselves for the benefit of the planet. This technique is known as the Delphi technique. I know some of you know that term. It was developed by the RAND Corporation decades ago for military use. And I've experienced it firsthand at the task force and in some local meetings, especially in Cary, they're doing that. I learned recently that a new term for visioning meeting is charrette, C-H-A-R-R-E-T-T-E. They're using that at North a lot. probably because people are catching on now that these meetings aren't all they're supposed to be. Each meeting, they're usually manipulated to a predetermined outcome by trained facilitators who are trained to run the meetings. This could be as a topic for another presentation. I'll skip it, but they manipulate you to think these are your ideas, but they're not. They bring you to a predetermined outcome. And citizens have to go on the offensive to restore principled methods for determining what a community or jurisdiction needs, not through facilitated outcomes with these funny techniques to give your opinions. They should be using Robert's Rules of Order, something that's a lot more straightforward. Okay. All right, here we go. A lot of you know about ICLEI. Maybe you don't. This is definitely the prime way that Agenda 21 Sustainable Development was brought into the local communities. ICLEI is known as the ICLEI stands for the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. A few years ago, they changed their name to ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, which is confusing to people. This is an old